come closer. It is time to rest now, and I will tell you a story that is very old, older than the houses we live in, older than the names people carry, a story made of stone and patience. This is a story about how something temporary becomes eternal, how a single thought, when guided by a process, can outlast the wind and the sand. Long ago, before the desert looked the way it does today, people lived by a wide river. This river was the heartbeat of the world. Every year, it would swell and rise, spilling over its banks to bring water and dark, rich soil to the thirsty land. The people lived in rhythm with this river. They knew when to plant and when to harvest. But more importantly, they knew when to look up. They watched the sky every night carefully because they believed the sky was not far away. They believed the stars were part of the same world, a map of what could be, if only they had the courage to build it. They understood that to create something lasting, one must first have the awareness of the cycles. They saw the stars as a destination and the river as the fuel. They believed that the soul, like the water, followed a path that had been laid out long before they arrived. In that land, people began building something that had never been built before, something so large and so careful that even now, after thousands of years, it still stands exactly where it was placed. They built the pyramids, but before the first stone was ever touched, there was the vision. They did not begin with the weight, they began with the alignment. They spent seasons simply watching. They watched where the sun hit the earth at the exact moment of dawn. They watched how the shadows of the reeds in the river grew long and thin, then vanished into the heat of the noon. They were gathering information. They were creating a funnel of intent, narrowing the vastness of the desert down to a single, perfect square on the ground. This was the first step of their work, the moment of awareness where the idea meets the earth. The landscape was vast and unforgiving, a sea of shifting dunes and jagged plateaus, yet they looked at this chaos and saw order. They saw a place where the physical and the celestial could meet. They spent years in this state of observation. They were not in a hurry. They understood that the most important part of any great endeavor is the period of quiet looking. They were mapping the market of the stars. They were understanding the environment in which their monument would live. They were identifying the exact point where the pressure of the earth was strongest and the air was clearest. The stones were cut slowly, not rushed, not forced, shaped by hands that understood weight and balance. Each stone was moved with effort and time, pulled across the ground little by little, day after day, season after season. Imagine the sound of the copper against the limestone, a steady, rhythmic chipping that echoed through the valley. It was the sound of 1,000 men and women working in a singular direction. The work did not finish quickly, and it was never meant to. They understood that a product intended for eternity cannot be assembled in a day. It must be productized through a series of repeatable, perfect actions. Each block had to be identical in its integrity, even if it differed in its shape. They created a system, a way of moving the impossible by breaking it down into the manageable. They organized themselves into teams, each team a vital part of the funnel, each person knowing exactly where their strength was needed. They were not just moving rocks, they were moving a vision forward. They were refining the raw material of the earth into the refined geometry of a dream. The pyramid grew gradually, so slowly that children who watched it begin grew older while it was still rising. And by the time it reached higher into the sky, those same children worked on it themselves. They were the second and third generations of the process. They had been nurtured by the vision of their parents. They did not see a pile of rocks. They saw a staircase to the stars. The movement of the stone became their language. They learned the friction of the sand, the way water could make a heavy sledge slide as if it were on ice. They learned that if the foundation was off by even the width of a finger, the peak would never meet the sky. This was their commitment to the process. They were building a funnel of stone, wide at the base to support the pressure of the world, narrowing as it rose toward the singular point of its purpose. They understood that the interest of the world would only be held if the structure was sound. They knew that a single flaw at the bottom would become a catastrophe at the top. So they checked, and they rechecked, and they found joy in the precision. The shape was chosen carefully, 4 sides rising evenly, each one facing a different direction: north, south, east, west, placed so precisely that even today the alignment remains almost perfect. This was not an accident. This was the result of a system that prioritized the truth of the measurement over the speed of the result. The builders paid close attention to the world around them, to the way the sun moved across the sky, to the way shadows stretched and shortened, to the way the stars returned to the same places again and again. They realized that to be remembered, one must be consistent. To have a legacy, one must have a geometry that does not fail when the weather changes. They used the stars as their guides, specifically the ones that did not move, the anchors of the northern sky. They aligned the base of the pyramid to these eternal points, ensuring that their work was tethered to something larger than the earth itself. They were creating a lead generation system for the soul, a way to draw the eye upward, away from the dust and toward the light. At night, when the land was quiet and the heat of the day had finally retreated into the earth, they watched a group of stars that never seemed to disappear. These were the circumpolar stars, the ones that never set, never touched the horizon, never died. They believed those stars were a place the soul could travel to, a permanent home in an ever-changing sky. They built the pyramid to be a mirror of that permanence. They were not just building a tomb, they were building a vessel for conversion, a place where a mortal life could be turned into an immortal story. They understood that the conversion happens in the heart of the structure, in the quiet places where the noise of the world is filtered out. They spent as much time planning the air inside the pyramid as they did the stone outside. They knew that for the transformation to be real, the environment had to be perfect. Inside the pyramid, there were long passages, narrow and quiet, leading inward, angled with purpose. These passages were not meant for the living to wander. They were paths of intent. They led to chambers deep inside, empty and plain, without pictures or writing, different from other places built for kings. There were no decorations to explain why it was built. Only stone. The stone was the message. The weight was the proof. Some believed the pyramid was a place of transformation, a structure meant to guide something unseen, something that did not need words. The air inside was cool and still, and sound moved differently there, echoing longer than expected, as if the stone itself was listening. When you stand in that silence, you realize that the greatest products do not need to shout. They hold their value in the core, in the deep chambers where the noise of the world cannot reach. This was the middle of their funnel, the place where the casual observer becomes a true believer, where the scale of the achievement finally settles into the bones. The base was leveled with extraordinary care. Water was used, pooled and guided, allowed to settle, until it revealed perfect stillness. From that stillness, the foundation was marked. This was the first act of patience, the understanding that if you do not start with a level mind and a level plan, the entire structure will eventually lean and fall. They spent years on the foundation alone, making sure the earth could support the dream. This is how you productize a legacy. You spend the time on the parts that no one will see, the parts that sit beneath the sand, because they are the parts that hold everything else up. They dug trenches in the bedrock, filling them with water to create a natural level that no wind could disturb. They carved into the very bones of the plateau, merging the mountain with their ambition. They were ensuring that their offer to the future was built on a reality that could not be shaken. They were not building on sand. They were building on the truth of the rock. As the foundation settled and the first layer of stones was locked into place, the true scale of the task began to reveal itself. This was no longer just a plan on a scroll or a dream discussed by the river. It was a living, breathing reality that demanded more than just muscle. It demanded a system. To move millions of tons of stone from the distant quarries of Aswan and the nearby hills of Tura, the builders had to master the art of the flow. They had to create a supply chain that never broke, a sequence of events so well timed that the work never stopped. This is the heart of nurturing a vision. It is the steady, relentless application of effort through a process that has been refined until it is frictionless. They built massive ramps, long inclines of rubble and brick, coated in wet clay to allow the sledges to glide. They understood that to move a great weight, you do not fight gravity, you use it. You find the path of least resistance, and you smooth it until the heavy becomes light. Quarrying of the stone was a meditation in itself. They did not strike the rock with anger. They used wooden wedges, driven into natural fissures and soaked with water. They waited as the wood expanded, letting the quiet force of nature do the heavy lifting of splitting the stone. This was the second step of their productization. They were not just taking raw material, they were selecting the best of it, treating it with respect, and preparing it for a specific place in the whole. Every block was numbered. Every block had a destination. There was no waste in their funnel of construction. If a stone was flawed, it was repurposed. If it was perfect, it was polished. They were building a culture of excellence, where the worker at the quarry and the architect at the summit were connected by a single thread of intent. They knew that the quality of the hidden stones, the ones deep in the core that no human eye would ever see again, mattered just as much as the casing stones that caught the light. Think of the logistical dance required to feed and house the thousands of people who gathered for this purpose. This was the back end of their great machine. They built cities for the workers, not as camps of suffering, but as communities of purpose. They baked bread in quantities that staggered the mind. They brewed beer to sustain the spirit. They provided medical care for those injured by the weight. They understood that the people were the true engine of the process. If the people were not nurtured, the stones would not move. This is the stage of the funnel where the vision is tested by the reality of human needs. You cannot reach the peak if you do not take care of the base. They created a cycle of rest and labor that mirrored the rising and setting of the sun. They turned a massive, terrifying undertaking into a series of small, daily victories. They made the impossible feel routine. As the pyramid rose higher, the air grew thinner and the heat more intense, yet the precision only increased. They were now moving into the phase of conversion, where the external structure begins to house the internal mysteries. The grand gallery was rising, a narrow, soaring passage of overlapping stone that defied the laws of weight. Each layer of masonry stepped inward, creating a corbelled vault that carried the pressure of the pyramid away from the path below. It was a masterpiece of engineering, a physical representation of how a process can be designed to handle immense pressure without collapsing. They were creating a transition, a way to move from the broad, open air of the desert into the focused, silent heart of the monument. This is where the casual observer is led into the deeper value of the offer. This is where the commitment becomes absolute. The builders used plumb bobs and sighting rods to ensure that the four corners remained true as they climbed. Every few layers, they would return to the stillness of the water levels to verify their progress. They were obsessed with the truth of the line. They knew that even a fraction of a degree of error at this stage would result in a twisted peak. This is the discipline of the system. You do not trust your feelings. You trust the measurement. You return to the fundamental principles again and again. They were teaching us that growth is not just about getting bigger. It is about staying aligned as you scale. The higher you go, the more the core must be reinforced. They filled the gaps with mortar and smaller stones, creating a solid mass that could vibrate as a single unit. They were building a resonance that would last for millennia. In the heat of the afternoon, the sound of the work changed. The heavy thud of the sledges was joined by the higher, crystalline ringing of the granite workers. They were now tackling the king's chamber, the heart of the entire structure. This was not the soft limestone of the outer walls. This was red granite from the far south. Stone so hard it could only be worked with sand and copper and infinite time. This was the core offer, the indestructible center that gave the rest of the pyramid its meaning. They spent years on this single room. They polished the walls until they were as smooth as glass and as dark as the night sky. They weren't just building a room, they were building a vacuum of sound, a place where the frequency of the earth could be felt in the marrow of the bones. They were converting raw effort into a spiritual legacy. They placed the great stone beams above the chamber, 5 layers of them, with empty spaces in between. These were the stress-relieving chambers. The builders knew that the weight of the mountain above would crush the heart of the pyramid if it weren't for these gaps of air. They understood the power of the void. They knew that sometimes the most important part of a structure is what isn't there. This is a lesson in delivery. To provide a truly great experience, you must build in the space for the user to breathe. You must protect the core from the pressure of the external world. They were masters of the hidden architecture, the systems that work in the dark to ensure the light can still reach the center. As the pyramid neared its completion, a new feeling took hold of the valley. The work was no longer a struggle against the earth. It was a reach toward the heavens. The capstone, the pyramidion, was prepared. It was often covered in gold or highly polished stone to catch the first and last rays of the sun. This was the final conversion, the moment the process reaches its ultimate point. It was the signal that the funnel had done its work. The wide base of the thousands had been narrowed down to a single, sharp point that pierced the sky. The alignment was checked one last time against the stars. The shafts were cleared. The air was stilled. The builders stood back and looked at what their patience had wrought. They had turned the temporary into the permanent. They had taken the flow of the river and the dust of the desert and turned them into a mountain of geometry that would outlive their language. But the work was not over when the last stone was placed. The delivery of a legacy requires the sealing of the promise. They began to pull down the ramps. They began to clear the debris of the construction. They were revealing the product to the world. As the rubble was moved away, the white limestone casing was polished until it was blinding. The pyramid began to glow. It became a mirror of the sun, a beacon that changed the very nature of the horizon. It was no longer a project. It was a presence. It was the ultimate advocacy of their skill. Anyone who saw it from miles away knew that a great truth had been realized here. They didn't need to explain the funnel. The results were visible to every eye in the kingdom. The silence that followed the completion of the pyramid was not the silence of an ending, but the silence of a beginning. It was the moment the project transitioned from a task to be managed into a legacy to be protected. This is the stage of retention, where the value of what has been built is tested by the slow, grinding movement of time. When the last of the ramps were cleared and the workers returned to their villages, the pyramid stood alone on the plateau, a white, shimmering mountain that seemed to vibrate with its own inner logic. The casing stones were joined so tightly that a hair could not be placed between them. It was a seamless delivery, a final product that offered no excuses and required no apologies. It was the manifestation of a promise kept. As the years turned into decades, the people who had built the pyramid began to pass away, their voices fading into the whispers of the river. But the structure they left behind did not age. It began its long watch over the desert. This is where the true power of a productized system is revealed. A well-built system does not require the presence of the builder to function. It stands on its own. It holds its alignment. The pyramid was designed to endure the shifting of the earth and the fury of the storms. It was built with a thermal mass so great that it regulated its own temperature, staying cool in the blistering heat and holding warmth in the freezing desert nights. It breathed with the planet. It was a living entity of stone, a witness to the persistence of human intent. The desert is a place of constant motion. Sand is never still. It climbs the base of the structure. It scours the surface. It fills the cracks. But the pyramid remained a constant in a world of variables. This is the essence of retention in your own work. It is about creating something so stable and so true that the chaos of the market cannot move it. The builders knew that the landscape would change. They knew the river might shift its course and the green fields might turn to dust. They built for the worst-case scenario. They built a foundation that reached deep into the bedrock, anchoring their vision to the very bones of the world. They were teaching us that if you want to last, you must build on what is permanent, not on what is popular. Then came the centuries of shifting stars. The earth has a slow wobble, a long cycle that takes thousands of years to complete. Because of this, The stars that the builders used for their alignment, the ones they thought were eternal, began to drift. The North Star of that time was not the North Star we see today. Yet, because the geometry of the pyramid was so perfect, the structure itself became a map of that drift. It held the memory of the sky as it was. It became a clock of the ages. It was no longer just a building. It was a scientific instrument, a repository of knowledge that outlasted the language of its creators. This is the ultimate advocacy of a great product. It becomes a teacher. It becomes a standard by which all other things are measured. It does not need to speak to tell its story. Its existence is the story. Think of the travelers who began to arrive from distant lands, Greeks, Romans, explorers from across the sea. They did not speak the language of the builders. They did not know the names of the kings or the architects. But when they stood in the shadow of the pyramid, they understood the scale of the achievement. They felt the weight of the patience that had gone into every block. They saw the 6-step process of the ancients written in the stone. They saw the awareness of the sky, the interest of the design, the nurture of the labor, the conversion of the spirit, the delivery of the form, and the advocacy of the endurance. They were drawn into the funnel of the pyramid's mystery. They became its messengers, carrying stories of the stone mountain back to their own homes. This is how a legacy scales. It moves beyond its original audience and begins to speak to the world. During the Middle Ages of the world, the pyramid faced its greatest trial. The outer casing stones, those beautiful, polished mirrors of limestone, were viewed as a resource. New cities were being built nearby. Rulers saw the pyramid not as a monument, but as a quarry of ready-made stone. One by one, the casing was stripped away. The smooth, white surface disappeared, leaving the rough, stepped core exposed to the sun. To a casual observer, it might have looked like the pyramid was being destroyed. But the core held. The builders had anticipated the greed of the future, just as they had anticipated the weather. They had built the internal structure with the same precision as the exterior. The removal of the skin did not weaken the heart. The alignment stayed true. The weight remained balanced. This is a lesson in the integrity of the core offer. Your outward appearance may change. The marketing of your life may be stripped away by circumstance. But if your core is solid, you will remain standing. Inside, in the deep silence of the granite chamber, nothing had changed. The air was still 68 degrees. The acoustic resonance was still perfect. The sarcophagus, carved from that single, unyielding block of granite, sat in the dark, waiting for a time that never seemed to arrive. It was a place outside of time. When you enter that space, the noise of the centuries falls away. You realize that the builders were not building for their own time. They were building for this exact moment of silence. They were creating a space where the human mind could confront the infinite without distraction. They had productized the experience of eternity. They had taken the most complex questions of existence and answered them with a simple, empty room made of the hardest stone on earth. As the desert expanded and the green valley retreated, the pyramid became a symbol of defiance. It stood as a reminder that the human spirit can impose its will upon the chaos of nature. It showed that through a disciplined process and a commitment to the long view, we can create things that are more than the sum of their parts. The pyramid was not just a pile of 2 million stones. It was a single, unified thought made manifest. It was a funnel that gathered the energy of a whole civilization and focused it into a single point. It was proof that when we align ourselves with the laws of the universe, with gravity, with geometry, with the stars, we become part of those laws. We become part of the endurance. Now we look at the marks left by the people who moved these stones. We see the lines where the copper saws bit into the rock. We see the places where the wet sand was used to polish the granite. These are not signs of struggle. They are signs of presence. They tell us that the process was not easy, but it was known. It was a path that had been walked many times before. The builders were not guessing. They were following a blueprint that had been etched into their culture over generations. They were the masters of the productized life. They knew that to build something great, you must first build the system that makes greatness possible. They were the ancestors of every person who has ever looked at a raw material and seen a finished masterpiece. The wind continued its work, and the shadow of the monument lengthened over the history of the world. As we come to the present age, we find ourselves standing where the travelers of old stood, looking up at the same angles, feeling the same weight of the unknown. We are the newest observers in a long line of witnesses. We arrive with our modern tools, our cameras, our lasers, and our satellites, hoping to peer through the stone and find a secret that has been hidden for 5,000 years. We look for hidden rooms and lost scrolls, but we often miss the greatest secret of all, which is sitting in plain sight. The secret is the process itself. The secret is the fact that it was done. The pyramid is a testament to the reality that a human vision, when filtered through a disciplined system, can become a permanent part of the Earth's crust. It is the ultimate proof of advocacy, where the product no longer needs to sell itself because its existence is the only argument required. In the modern world, everything is fast. We build with steel and glass, materials that reflect the light, but do not hold the heat. We build for the next quarter, the next year, the next decade, if we are lucky. We have forgotten the art of the stone. We have forgotten that the most powerful thing you can build is something that does not change when the fashion changes. The pyramid stands as a silent critique of our haste. It reminds us that the 6-step funnel of the ancients is still the only way to create true endurance. You must start with the awareness of the horizon. You must generate interest through the perfection of your geometry. You must nurture the work through the long, repetitive middle. You must convert the raw material into a core of granite. You must deliver a product that requires no explanation, and you must allow the work to become its own advocate, standing firm while the sand of the world shifts around it. Think of the silence inside the Queen's chamber, or the narrow, upward reach of the air shafts. These were not just architectural details, they were the final refinements of a productized vision. They were the ways the builders ensured that the structure remained relevant to the stars, even as the earth moved. This is the lesson of the final step. To have a legacy, you must build into your work a way to stay aligned with the truth, even when the environment changes. You must build in the flexibility of the void and the strength of the mountain. The pyramid did not belong to a single king, regardless of whose name was associated with it. It belonged to the geometry of the universe. It belonged to the math of the sun and the stars. That is why it is still here. It didn't fight the world, it aligned with it. We live in an era of noise, where everyone is shouting for attention. But the pyramid does not shout. It simply exists. It draws people from every corner of the globe, not through a loud advertisement, but through the gravity of its achievement. This is the goal of every great creator, every builder of a business, every teller of a story. You want to create something with so much mass and so much integrity that people cannot help but be pulled into its orbit. You want to build a funnel that doesn't just catch leads, but catches the imagination of the future. You want to be the one who left the mark that the wind could not erase. The stones of the pyramid are limestone and granite, but the mortar that holds them together is the human will to be remembered. As the sun begins to set over the plateau, the pyramid turns a deep, burning orange. For a few moments, it looks as it did when it was new, a glowing mountain of fire against the cooling sky. In this light, the thousands of years between the builders and us seem to vanish. We are all just people trying to make sense of the vastness. We are all just trying to build something that says we were here, that we saw the stars, and that we tried to reach them. The pyramid is a mirror. If you look at it and see only a tomb, you are seeing your own fear of the end. But if you look at it and see a staircase, a system, and a triumph of the process, you are seeing your own potential. You are seeing what happens when you stop rushing and start building for eternity. The question of why it was built this way still lingers in the air. Some say it was a power plant, others a map of the earth, others a gate to the heavens. But perhaps the answer is simpler. Perhaps it was built this way because that is what happens when humans decide to be as patient as the stone. Perhaps it was built this way to show us that the 6-step process is not a burden, but a path to freedom. By submitting to the discipline of the measurement, the builders freed themselves from the limits of a single lifetime. They joined the cycle of the stars. They made their names synonymous with the horizon. They turned the act of construction into an act of worship. Now it is your turn to return to your own work. The story is over, but the building is just beginning. Take the lessons of the river and the rock back with you into the light of the morning. Remember that the foundation is the most important part, even if it is buried. Remember that the core must be made of the hardest material you can find. Remember that the alignment must be checked against the things that do not move. If you follow the steps, if you respect the weight, and if you have the patience to let the water settle, you too can build something that the sand cannot cover. You can build your own pyramid, block by block, day by day, until the peak touches the sky and the world falls silent in its presence. The desert is quiet now. The tourists have gone, the lights have dimmed, and the stars have returned to their places. Orion climbs over the southern face, exactly where he has been for thousands of years. The pyramid stays aligned. It stays silent. It waits for the next generation of builders to come and learn its secrets. It waits for you to realize that you are the architect of your own endurance. The stone is ready. The tools are in your hands. The river is rising. It is time to begin. Sleep now and dream of the geometry of your own life. Dream of the mountain you will leave behind. For when you wake, the sun will hit the earth at the exact point of dawn, and the first stone will be waiting for you to move it. Story does not end here. It continues in every line you draw, every system you build, and every promise you keep. The pyramid is not a relic of the past. It is a blueprint for your future. It is the proof that you can be eternal if only you have the courage to be patient. Close your eyes and feel the weight of the stone pressing downward, steady and sure. Feel the air moving through the shafts, connecting you to the stars. You are part of the story now. You are part of the stone, and the stone never forgets. There now, your eyes are heavy, and the weight of the day is finally drifting away. Let the vastness of the desert and the strength of the stones settle into your mind like a warm blanket. You are safe here, held by the same earth that supports the great monuments we spoke of. Just as the builders rested when the sun went down, it is your time to let your thoughts become still. You have listened well, and your heart has traveled across the sands and through the chambers of time. Now let your dreams be the place where you build your own worlds, where you reach for your own stars. The river will still be flowing when you wake, and the sun will find its path to your window just as it always has. Close your eyes, my little architect, and rest deep in the quiet. Sleep now, for tomorrow I have more stories for you.